Terror on the Ruby Ridge. Throughout this book you will notice portions that are underlined or capitalized. I have added this emphasis to call your attention to words or phrases of special importance. Len Martin. Introduction. Federal agents have invaded each of the 50 sovereign states that make up the union called the United States of America. In doing so, they are violating the sovereignty of the states and infringing upon the rights of the citizens. Included in this army of federal agents are bands of prowling gunslingers. Occasionally, they go too far in carrying out their acts of oppression and it ends up in a fiasco. One of those recent federally created messes occurred in Idaho on August 21, 1992, when a US Marshal killed a 14-year-old boy. This act, and the killing of his mother the next day, can rightfully be termed murder. These acts necessitated further acts of oppression and aggression in order to cover up the original crimes and try to throw blame on the real victims. It is this type of invasion into state matters via federal agents that is undermining the strength of our country. For 11 days, 16-year-old Sarah Weaver was caring for her father, Randy, and a friend, Kevin Harris, who had been shot by US Marshals. Her mother, Vicky, lay on the floor, covered with a blanket, dead. Outside in a shed lay her 14-year-old brother, Sam, also dead. Her 11-year-old sister was in a frantic state and her 10-month-old sister, Elisheba, was crying mama, mama, mama. Outside were professional snipers, US Marshals, and other federal agents who were responsible for creating the heartbreaking scene inside the Weavers' cabin. These federal agents lit the cabin with floodlights and added to the terror by making remarks like, "Good morning, Randall. How did you sleep? We're having pancakes. What are you having?" The force of gunmen was to grow to an estimated 500. Surrounded by this army, Sarah feared that they would all end up dead. How would you feel if you were in Sarah's shoes during the 11-day siege by US Marshals, aided by other federal, state and local officials? Most people who follow news media reports about action taken by law enforcement officials take the attitude that these people must have done something unlawful or the enforcers wouldn't be after them, an attitude that where there is smoke, there must be fire. Sadly, it is not generally known that the major newspapers, TV, and radio outlets are owned or otherwise controlled by the very same super rich who have power over actions of the US Marshals and other law enforcement agencies. With their immense wealth, they are able to buy politicians and bureaucrats, including the people who form what has become a national police force. While the average American looks upon these police as honorable government officials, the estimated 500 gunmen surrounding the Weavers' cabin were little more than agents of the super rich, who, from behind the scenes, run our country. To relate the assault on the Weavers at Ruby Ridge would not be complete without adding supporting information into the story. Unless enough Americans become informed of the various facets of unlawful actions by officials at all levels of government, those Americans who dare to take action to preserve their liberties are in danger of being targeted by gun-toting agents of the super rich and powerful. Terror on Ruby Ridge. There are a few good marshals left in the service, but they are getting fewer and farther between. The FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, isn't quite as bad, but it's getting that way. This remark was made to me by an honorable US Marshal, the late Harold Bud Warren, following the attack on Gordon Cowell, his wife, son and 3 friends near Medina, North Dakota, February 13, 1983. Gordon Cowell was later killed in cold blood in Arkansas by US Marshals and assorted other taxpayer-financed gunslingers. Getting rid of Gordon Cowell served 2 purposes for the super wealthy, who, from behind the scenes, direct the US Marshals, FBI and other people control enforcement agencies. 1. It silenced someone who was active in exposing the anti-family, anti-American and anti-Christian actions of political and bureaucratic prostitutes who have taken over our lawful government. 2. It threw the populace of North Dakota and surrounding area into a state of fear. They became obedient slaves, fearful that they might be next if they dared speak out against government officials who are involved in criminal activity. An official in the North Dakota Tax Department stated that collecting taxes became much easier after the Cowell shooting. Throughout the past few decades, many people have become targeted victims of unlawful acts by US Marshals, backed up by the FBI, BATF, Bureau of Alcohol, tobacco and firearms, and local officials. Randy Weaver and his family and friend are a few of the more recent victims, and unless enough Americans wake up, they won't be the last. In viewing unlawful acts being committed by US Marshals and other federal government agents, I shall concentrate on the two most infamous cases in recent history, that of Gordon Kahl and the current Randy Weaver case. Federal jurisdiction is very limited. A few years ago, there were various TV shows depicting the heroics of US Marshals in the Wild West. Their exploits were carried out lawfully because these lands were owned by the federal government. 4. Terror on Ruby Ridge. But when these federal lands became states, the federal jurisdiction was transferred to the newly formed states, and with this, the role of the US Marshals became severely limited. There are two jurisdictions, federal and state. There is a considerable amount of material available regarding the jurisdiction issue. I have chosen to use the following material taken from the work of Larry Beckraft, one of the few honorable lawyers in America, with supplemental material from the research of David Horton, another honorable lawyer. In the United States of America, there are two separate and distinct jurisdictions, state jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction. Broadly speaking, state jurisdiction encompasses the legislative power to regulate, control, and govern real personal property, individuals and enterprises within the boundaries of any given state. In contrast, federal jurisdiction is extremely limited. To prove that the federal government has limited jurisdiction, let's go back in history and review the formation of the colonies. Each of the 13 colonies was established separately. Each had its own governor, legislative assembly and courts. The only common bond they had is that each was established by charters granted by England. When England became too repressive of the colonists' rights, each of the colonies separately broke its ties and relations with England. The Declaration of Independence, signed by representatives of these 13 independent colonies, lawfully made each colony a separate and independent nation over which there was no other government. To better facilitate their defense against the British troops in the war that followed, the Revolutionary War, they formed an alliance, much like the United States, Great Britain, France, etc., formed an alliance in the wars against Germany. The treaty which concluded the Revolutionary War was one where the 13 colonies were recognized as sovereign states/nations. Many of them had their own diplomatic delegations. Many issued their own money, and we have the exact language from the Treaty of Peace itself where His Britannic Majesty acknowledged that. 5. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The said United States, that is New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, New York, etc., to be free, sovereign and independent states. By this they meant that the colonies were free, sovereign and independent nations. The leaders of the 13 new nations realized that alone each of them was not strong enough to withstand an attack by a foreign power. So they formed a closer alliance than they had during the war. The rules of how this alliance was to proceed were spelled out in the Articles of Confederation. In writing the articles, the representatives of the 13 independent states/nations jealously guarded their independence. They realized the dangers of giving too much power to a central body, government, even though this central body would mainly be made up of representatives of these 13 independent states/nations. And thus the Articles of Confederation were written in a manner that preserved the independence of the 13 states/nations. Each of the 13 states/nations retired its independence with only limited power given to the central government. These powers dealt mainly with protecting the rights of the 13 independent states and the rights of the people who made up these states. They didn't agree to bind themselves permanently under the Article of Confederation. Any of the 13 states was at liberty to go its separate way, if it so desired. After a few years, it became obvious to the independent states that the Articles of Confederation did not give the central government enough power to adequately protect the states. So another convention was called. At this convention, it was the intention of the Confederation to give the federal government a little more power in order to facilitate a better working relationship between the states. The new rules under which the separate states would operate were issued under the title Constitution of the United States of America. A more appropriate name would be the Constitution of the States of America United, or the Constitution of the Nations of America United. Now that we have 50 states, the independent status of the states has not changed. At least, it was not supposed to change. But over the years 6. Terror on Ruby Ridge. We have been misinformed by the news media and companies that publish the textbooks for our state-approved schools. To our sorrow, we uninformed citizens have grown up not realizing we were supposed to be independent states virtually free from meddling by the federal government. Court decisions support sovereignty of the states. That the United States of America is a union of sovereign, independent states is supported by many court decisions. Let us read some of those decisions. The several states which compose this union became entitled, from the time they declared themselves independent, to all the rights and powers of sovereign states. McIlvaine v. Cox's Lessee, 8 U.S. 4 Branch, 209, 1808. The soil and sovereignty within their acknowledged limits were as much there at the Declaration of Independence as at this hour. Harcourt v. Gaylord, 25 U.S. 12 Wheat, 513, 1829. If each state is sovereign, that means each state has jurisdiction over all activities that take place within the boundaries of the state. Then what jurisdiction does the federal government have? That question is plainly answered in Article I, Section 8, Clause 17 of the Constitution. To exercise legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district, not exceeding 10 miles square. 2. Become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places, purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. You will notice that except for the District of Columbia, the 10 square miles on which the US Capitol is located, it is stressed that federal land use is for military purposes, to protect the people of the states from enemy foreign powers. Take further note that for the federal government to obtain land from any of the states, the land must be purchased by the federal government or ceded to it with the consent of the legislature. 7. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Of the state involved. Only then does the federal government have jurisdiction over land within a state, and only that land sold or ceded to the federal government by action of the state legislature. Did the North Dakota legislature sell or cede the land on which the road north of Medina was built? No such action was recorded. Therefore, since this land on which the attack took place had not been sold or ceded to the federal government by the North Dakota legislature, the 4 U.S. Marshals, agents of the federal government, were out of their jurisdiction. They had no right to be attempting an official act on land that was under the jurisdiction of North Dakota. Likewise, the U.S. Marshals had no right to be in Idaho, let alone trespassing on Randy Weaver's property. Following are a few court decisions to support the fact that federal officials have no right to trespass on state property. The legislation and authority of Congress is confined to cessations by particular states for the seat of government, the District of Columbia, and purchases made by consent of the legislature of the state for the purpose of erecting forts. The legislative power and exclusive jurisdiction remained in the several states of all territory within their limits, not ceded or purchased by Congress, with the assent of the state legislature. Commonwealth v. Young, Brightly NP 301, par. 1818. Special provision is made in the Constitution for the cession of jurisdiction from the states over places where the federal government shall establish forts and other military works. And it is only in these places where it can exercise general jurisdiction. New Orleans v. United States, 35 U.S. 10 Ped 662, 1836. This court decision emphasized the point that federal jurisdiction within states is limited to establish forts and other military works. A state has the same undeniable and unlimited jurisdiction over all persons and things within its territorial limits as any foreign nation. All those powers which relate to mere municipal legislation, or what may perhaps more properly be called internal police, are not restrained, and that consequently, in relation to these, the authority of the state is complete, unqualified and exclusive. New York v. Milne, U.S. 11 Pet 102, 1837. The United States have no constitutional capacity to exercise municipal jurisdiction, sovereignty or eminent domain, within the limits of a state or elsewhere, except in the cases in which it is expressly granted. 8. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Pollard v. Hadgen, 44 U.S. 13 How 212, 1845. These cases should be enough to prove that no federal government official has the right to try and exercise authority in any part of a state, except small areas which the state legislature has expressly sold or ceded to the feds. This includes ICE, OSHA, EPA and other federal agents, and yes, including US Marshals. From these court decisions, it is very obvious the US Marshals had no right to attempt to arrest Gordon Kahl or Andy Weaver, since the Marshals were acting in an area that was out of their jurisdiction, and since Marshals were killed. Who has jurisdiction to decide on the guilt or innocence of the people involved? The states of North Dakota and Idaho, or the federal government? The feds take the attitude that, if a federal official is involved, the feds have jurisdiction over the judicial proceedings. They ignore court cases citing jurisdiction. Especially significant is the following court decision: to bring the offense within the jurisdiction of the Union, federal, it must have been committed out of the jurisdiction of a state. It is not, Chief Justice Marshall says, the offense committed, but the place in which it was committed. People v. Godfrey, 17 Johns 225 NY, 1819. From the case cited, the fact that federal officials were killed is not the determining factor of who has jurisdiction over the judicial proceedings. The determining factor is that the action took place on state property. Since the Marshals were out of their jurisdiction, a North Dakota grand jury would likely have indicted the surviving Marshals with a variety of crimes, including assault and attempted murder, and an informed trial jury, acting without the interference of a corrupt judge, would have found the Marshals guilty. In the Weaver case, action has been taken by Idaho citizens to indict the trespassing Marshals and other federal agents. The cover-up gang in the federal building in Fargo, North Dakota, got away with taking jurisdiction because we stupid citizens were educated in state-approved schools, as well as deceived by the news media. Since I'm on the matter of jurisdiction, it is an appropriate time to bring forth the powers and duties of sheriffs. 9. Terror on Ruby Ridge. A sheriff is the chief executive officer of a county. As you have read, there is convincing proof that the state of North Dakota had jurisdiction over Gordon Kahl and the land north of Medina, where he was attacked by 4 federal agents, assisted by one of the Stutsman County Sheriff's deputies and a Medina police officer, not the chief of police. And the state of Idaho had jurisdiction over the property, owned by Randy Weaver, who within the state, had the right to arrest Gordon Kahl and Randy Weaver, if arrests were warranted. For the answer, let's go to Anderson on sheriffs. His treatise on sheriffs is backed up with court decisions about the powers and duties of sheriffs. Walter Anderson, assisted by others, wrote, "The sheriff is the chief law enforcement officer in the county today, even as he was at common law. It is not only the power, but the duty, of sheriffs and their various jurisdictions, the county, to preserve the peace, enforce the laws and arrest, and commit to jail felons and other infractions of statutes or common law, and to execute all processes to him directed, and attend upon the trial courts and to preserve the peace. To assist him, he may command all the people of his county to attend him, which is called the posse comitatus, or the power of the county, and thus summon every person above 15 years old." The news media played it up real big that Gordon was a member of the posse comitatus, and that the posse was an outlaw, vigilante type group. As you can see, the posse is a legitimate group to which every person in a county above age 15 belongs. This is supported by information printed in the North Dakota Law Review, Volume 61, Number 1, 1985, which, in part, reads, "The term posse comitatus means the entire population of a county above the age of 15, which a sheriff may summon for assistance in the performance of his duties." To prohibit using the military in a civilian enforcement role, Congress passed and President Hayes signed the legislation June 18, 1878, and 10. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The Posse Comitatus Act became law. Did you get that? And the Posse Comitatus Act became law. If the sheriff of Wells County, North Dakota, where Gordon Kahl lived, and the sheriff of Boundary County, Idaho, where Andy Weaver lived, had formed Posse Comitatus units to help them preserve the peace, the US Marshals would not have dared to attack Gordon or Andy and their respective families as they did. Gordon Kahl murdered in Arkansas. When US Marshals and 2 local police officers attacked Gordon Kahl, 2 family members and 3 friends on a road north of Medina, North Dakota. Evidence certainly proves that U.S. Marshal for North Dakota, Kenneth Moo, shot Gordon's son, Yuri. Shots by other officers seriously injured Yuri. Seeing that his son had been shot, Gordon took action. He killed 2 of the marshals and wounded another, as well as wounding the 2 local officers. Under cover of a dense fog that lasted several days, Gordon escaped through the network of federal agents that quickly formed. He ended up in a home in rural Arkansas. Betrayed as to his whereabouts by the daughter of a good patriot, U.S. Marshals and other federal gunmen planned an attack, but they had the local sheriff, Matthews, to contend with. Years later, I spent several days visiting with a person who, at the time of the Fed's murder of Gordon, was a deputy under Sheriff Matthews. He said the night before the killing of Gordon, there was a hot dispute at a meeting in the Walnut Ridge Fire Hall. Present were U.S. Marshals and other federal officials and Sheriff Matthews. According to this deputy, Matthews told the federal officers that this was his county and he would arrest Gordon, and that federal officials had no right, jurisdiction, to infringe on his job. It was one man against a whole SWAT team, so the next morning, when Sheriff Matthews went out to where Gordon was staying, the Fed SWAT team was with him. 11. Terror on Ruby Ridge. When it was over, both Gordon and Sheriff Matthews were dead. The official, government, version of what took place was that Gordon and Sheriff Matthews had shot each other simultaneously. This was impossible, because Gordon was killed by a shot in the back of the head, and Sheriff Matthews was shot under the left arm at an angle from the back. Since Matthews is right-handed, he would have needed to shoot over his shoulder at Gordon, if Gordon was to have shot Matthews in the left armpit from behind. The government's version of what happened in the Gordon Cal affair, as related by the news media, was contrary to the facts. Just as the government's version of what took place on Ruby Ridge involving federal gunman and Randy Weaver doesn't mesh with obvious and suspected actions that existed and evolved. Government officials give flimsy reasons for attacking Gordon Kahl and Randy Weaver. The official reasons given by government officials for instigating the attacks on both Gordon and Randy are pretty flimsy, if not suspect. Randy was accused of sawing off part of the barrel of a shotgun and selling it to 2 agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, BATF. Randy said this was untrue, so we have their word against his. Given the deceit and unlawful acts being committed by today's US Marshals, FBI, BATF and other police-type agencies, it would be foolish to believe their version over Randy's. The reason given for attacking Gordon Cal was equally ridiculous. He was wanted on a highly suspect warrant for parole violation. He had served a year in prison for an income tax violation. Cal's defense lawyer said in court that Mr. Cal is not being prosecuted for violating income tax laws. He is being prosecuted for daring to go on television and talking about it. In this respect, the Weaver situation is similar. His defense lawyer in the upcoming trial said the man is simply being prosecuted for what they allege his beliefs are, rather than for the crimes that he allegedly committed. 12. Terror on Ruby Ridge. After Gordon was released from prison and refused to honor the faulty probation, a few half-hearted attempts were made to arrest him. But, in the main, he was left alone. If they really wanted to arrest him, they could have done so as he freely walked the streets of central North Dakota towns. The parole period ended in August 1982, 6 months before the Marshals' attack on him. In 1982, Kenneth Moo, the U.S. Marshal for North Dakota, received orders from Washington to put away the file on Gordon Cal and not expend any more energy trying to apprehend him. U.S. Marshal Harold Bud Warren told me this order was given by phone, by wire, and by letter. Did Moo ignore the letter? Or did the Marshal Service in Washington send a new one canceling the order to leave Gordon alone? Whichever, it seems there was a lot of fuss being made over a man who supposedly committed a measly misdemeanor, just as was made over an alleged shortening of a shotgun by Randy Weaver. It isn't just average people who buck the system that get targeted for punishment, even elimination. Government officials who become whistleblowers or otherwise threaten to upset the higher-ups in government also become targets for punishment, even elimination. Evidence indicates that Sheriff Matthews was killed by US Marshals, assisted by other government gunmen, because he was upset over the intrusion by federal officials into his jurisdiction, and would likely blow the lid on anything they unlawfully did to Gordon Cal. This mentality may have been the cause of death of US Marshal William Degan on Ruby Ridge, Idaho. Degan was the most highly decorated marshal in the service's 203-year history. But a recent activity he led disturbed some big shots in Washington, D.C. He had begun cleaning up the drug scene in Washington, D.C. and he didn't care whose toes he stepped on in the process. In doing so, he was getting too close to George Bush's heavy involvement in our national drug trafficking business. Information available indicates that high government officials are involved in drug trafficking, and naturally they don't want to be exposed. 13. Nor do they want their highly profitable racket stopped. In high government positions as they are able to take steps to stop those who dare try to expose them. By sending US Marshal Degan to be with the attack team in Idaho, two objectives could be accomplished. 1. Set him up to be eliminated by a fellow marshal, and 2. Blame his death on someone in the Weaver cabin, enabling them to draw attention away from the deaths of any of the Weavers who might be killed. According to research by writer Maynard Campbell Jr., evidence tends to show that Degan was shot by one of the marshals, just as Sheriff Matthews was killed by federal gunmen in Arkansas. In the Gordon Cal case, US Marshals and other police gunmen succeeded in killing their target after their fiasco at Medina, and in silencing a likely witness, Sheriff Matthews. But in the attempt on Randy Weaver, something went wrong. In spite of a desperate campaign to cover up their acts of misconduct, the truth may yet be exposed to the nation, because Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris are still alive and face a frame-up trial in February 1993. At that time it is expected much of the truth will be brought to light. Murder on Ruby Ridge. I have read and reread articles about the siege at Ruby Ridge as events developed. The ones that appeared in the mainline newspapers made Randy Weaver look like a bad guy, and that he, his son, wife and their friend Kevin Harris had committed serious crimes against government law enforcement officials. But in comparing the various reports, it is clear there are serious discrepancies. In fact, some of it violates common sense. In all fairness, it is necessary to tell what happened on Ruby Ridge as related by the surviving Weaver family and their close friend, Kevin Harris. It went like this. Randy Weaver, 44, his 14-year-old son, Sammy and family friend, Kevin Harris, 24, who lived with the Weavers, were working around their mountaintop cabin on the morning of Friday, August 21, 1992, when they heard one of the dogs barking in the woods. 14. Terror on Ruby Ridge. They believed that a deer or other wild game, one of the family's main sources of food, had been flushed out of the undergrowth by the dog, a Labrador Retriever, Striker that Sammy had raised from a pup. Sammy and Kevin grabbed their hunting rifles and headed in the direction of the barking dog. Randy went off at an angle figuring the wild game might be chased that way by Sammy and Kevin. As Sammy reached the spot where his dog, Striker, was barking, a shot rang out killing Sammy's dog. Saddened and angered over the shooting of his pet, Sammy, who was closest, yelled, "You shot Striker, you son of a B underscore," and fired in the direction where he thought the shot had come from. Hearing the shooting and Sammy's yells, Randy shot into the air to attract Sammy and Kevin and yelled to them to get back to the cabin. Another shot rang out and Sammy was hit in the arm. Sammy turned to run to the cabin and was shot in the back. By this time, Kevin had reached Sammy and learned he had been shot. Realizing they were under attack, Kevin shot in the direction from which the shots had come and then started running toward the cabin, stopping only long enough to check on Sammy and realizing that Sammy was dead. Back at the cabin, Kevin related what had happened. When Vicky learned that Sammy was dead, she insisted on bringing him to the cabin immediately. So Vicky, Randy and Kevin disregarded the possibility that Sammy's killers were still in the woods, went to Sammy, and brought him back to the cabin. Sammy's sisters, Sarah, 16, and Rachel, age 11, washed his body and wrapped him in a white sheet. Sammy's body was taken to a nearby shed to await burial. There was no gunfire during this time. Gunmen returned the next day. On Saturday, August 22, 1992, the day after Sammy was killed, the remaining dogs, which were tied up, began barking. Randy, Kevin and Sarah went outside to see if there was anything they should be concerned about. Randy went to the shed to see Sammy and to pray. As he reached for the latch, a bullet went through his upper arm. Vicky shouted for the three to come in the cabin. Sarah shielded Randy as they ran. Later she 15. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Said if they were going to kill someone, it would have to be a child. Vicky was holding the door open. As they entered the cabin, a bullet struck Vicky's forehead, blowing off part of her head. The same bullet or fragments from Vicky's head broke one of Kevin's ribs and punctured one of his lungs. Vicky was pulled into the cabin and placed under the kitchen table, where she laid in a pool of blood for 8 days. There wasn't enough water left to wash Vicky's body. The killing of 2 members of the Weaver family and the wounding of Randy and Kevin made the survivors realize the intent of the gunman likely was to kill all of them too. They didn't know for sure, but they, especially Randy, knew the viciousness of government police agents and suspected the gunmen were government agents. To keep the gunman from being able to see the movements of the survivors in the cabin, the windows were covered with blue denim material, leaving the cabin in virtual darkness. Sarah and Rachel cared for the wounds of their father and Kevin with herbs. One report told about a Red Cross official who was with the FBI team the day Vicky was killed by an FBI sniper. He was absolutely disgusted by the ruthless attitude of the personnel on the scene. The Red Cross official said they were preparing their machine guns and putting on bulletproof armor. I was standing directly behind 3 of them. They said, "We are going to wipe them out. Nobody is going to come off that hill alive." Those remarks show the criminal mentality of one of our nation's top police agencies. It's like the late US Marshal Harold Bud Warren told me in 1985. There are a few good marshals left in the service, but they are getting fewer and farther between. The FBI isn't quite as bad, but it's getting that way. Today's members of the US Marshal Service, FBI, BATF and Secret Service are carefully picked for their willingness to follow orders, even orders to kill or harass innocent people. 16. Terror on Ruby Ridge. If you read what kind of men were the US Marshals who attacked Gordon Cowell, you will learn the devious mentality of 3 of the 4 marshals who were involved in the attack. The decorated Phoenix police officer, Jack McLam, now retired, wrote in one of his aid and abet newsletters, "The first thing we are told in police academy is to trust only your fellow police officers. This type of training tends to build in the minds of candidates for police work a wall between them and the general citizenry, as well as a certain amount of suspicion." A police officer in my home state of North Dakota decided to go to the police academy expecting it would help him be a better officer. He quit police work because the others who were training were hippies of the worst type. It is frightening to realize that this type of individual is toting guns while laws are being passed that are designed to take guns away from law-abiding citizens. From what the Red Cross official said, we can assume it was this type of characters who made up the FBI team that stated they were going to wipe out the Weavers and Kevin Harris. On Sunday, August 23, 1992, the 3rd day of the siege, federal agents embarked on a mission that, from appearances, was designed to wipe out the entire family. They brought in a helicopter and loaded it with a container of fuel, probably diesel. The helicopter took off and headed toward Weaver's cabin. Fortunately, there were witnesses to this escapade. A mountain beside Randy's property was owned by a right-minded guy. From it, one can look down on Weaver's cabin. Jack, the property owner, and some newsmen were video recording what was taking place around the helicopter. When the helicopter took off and headed for Weaver's cabin, Jack and the newsman feared it would dump the fuel on the cabin and ignite it. Trying to stop this from happening, Jack jumped up and down waving his arms to catch the attention of the pilot. The pilot did see Jack and he also noticed that he was being videotaped. The pilot flew the helicopter to the cabin, circled it twice and then 17. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Headed back to the government man base in the valley. The newsmen were arrested and charged with obstructing justice, but they succeeded in getting the video film out and delivered to news agencies in the area. After the Saturday, August 22, 1992, killing of Vicky and wounding of Randy and Kevin, no one left the cabin for days fearing they would be shot. They hugged the wood floor of the cabin. They could hear the sound of people, undoubtedly government agents, under the cabin which stands on stilts. Even though it was quite dark with the windows covered, the Weavers could see well enough to read scriptures, and they prayed often. They gave cayenne pepper and herbs to Kevin, who was spitting blood and in great pain. They also showered his wounds with 3 bottles of peroxide to prevent infection. They thought they were going to lose him the first night. Elisheba, the 10-month-old baby, cried during the night, and was saying mama, mama, mama. Randy was crying, I know baby, your mama's gone. As early as Sunday, they yelled to the federal agents that Vicky Weaver was dead, but this was not revealed by officials until Friday. Unknown to the survivors in the cabin, more gunslingers along with an assortment of military equipment was being brought in and assembled at the foot of the mountain. If they had known, it would have added to their fear of being wiped out. At the same time, developments were taking place that, if the herbivores had known, would have heartened them. Assembling right next to the government gunmen were neighbors and other concerned people who didn't know the Weavers, but were disgusted by the manner in which the gunmen had attacked the Weavers. Some of the supporters were well aware of the viciousness of the US Marshals when they targeted someone. The crowd was to grow to 200 people. Many of them carried signs saying things like, "Am I next?" and "We will not tolerate an act of war in Idaho." 18. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The Spokane Spokesman Review stated to the effect, the constant taunting and the scores of signs have begun to wear on law enforcement officials. The presence of these 200 Weaver supporters made it tougher for the gunmen to get away with further misconduct. The attempt to torch the cabin by dropping diesel fuel on it by helicopter and igniting it was the last overt act against the Weavers and Kevin Harris. The presence of 200 outraged supporters brought the action to a stalemate. However, there was an attempt to entice Randy to show himself. A robot with a telephone attached was rolled by remote control to the cabin. Randy was told to pick up the phone. This he refused to do. Paul Harvey said acts of lawman looks pretty silly. To try to stop further bloodshed, famed radio commentator Paul Harvey went on the air. The Spokesman Review related Harvey's comments thusly, "Of course I'm not taking sides with anyone's political philosophy. All I want to do is prevent any further bloodshed." Nevertheless, in a 3-minute personal plea, Harvey leveled his sharp tongue at the army of law officers surrounding the cabin, saying Weaver was probably wondering how you, Weaver, wanting to be left alone, have come to be held captive by more than 200 lawmen. T wonder too, with all the crass criminals we have running around in this country, this focus on you, Weaver, certainly constitutes grotesque overkill and frankly, from an objective distance, looks pretty silly. With the government gunmen's shenanigans being brought to the attention of a large portion of the American people by Paul Harvey, the gunmen were further forced to curtail any planned murder of the herbivores of the initial attacks. One course of action the feds need to pursue was a cover-up, and pursue it they did. The main tool in covering up government misconduct is the news. 19. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Media. As in other cases of such misconduct, news reporters merely repeat what they are told by government agents, and the news media repeats and repeats the government version. They follow the principle that people can be made to believe anything if only one side is given, and if repeated often enough, people can be made to believe lies. About newsmen, the late famed journalist John Swinton was on target when, at a banquet for journalists, he stated, "There is no such thing as an independent press in America, you know this, and I know it. Not a man among you dares to utter his honest opinion. Were you to utter it, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print. It is the duty of a journalist to lie, to distort, to revile, to use bad words, and to sell his country for his salary. We are the tools and the vassals, servants, of the rich behind the scenes. We are marionettes. These men pull the strings and we dance. Our time, our talents, our lives, our capacities are the property of these men. We are intellectual prostitutes." In most cases, it was this type of intellectual prostitute, who works for the establishment news outlets, that reported events in the siege at Ruby Ridge. Sometimes oppressive acts by our government officials are too much even for the intellectual prostitutes to accept. Apparently, what took place on Ruby Ridge was one of those times. David Trockman was present during the standoff and was able to visit with reporters. In writing about it, he said, reporters for news prepares and TV were having their stories changed by their editors after they sent their reports to their offices. Both newspaper and TV reporters were very upset that the truth was not getting out. The greatest cover-up gang in America. Martin Red Beckman, Montana's Fighting Redhead, has called US attorneys and US district judges the greatest cover-up gang in America. Sure enough, The attack on Ruby Ridge was hardly over when a US attorney went to work to throw the blame on Randy Weaver. 20. Terror on Ruby Ridge. An article in the Spokane Spokesman Review, in part, reads, U.S. Attorney William Hislop told a group of Rotarians that federal firearms laws, like the one that made Randy Weaver a fugitive, are a valuable tool in fighting rising violent crime. Although Weaver had no criminal history prior to the federal sting that led to the charges, Hislop did not agree that Weaver was not violent. Certainly the killing of the federal law enforcement official, by any standard, is a violent crime, he said. Baloney. Killing an officer is not a crime if it is done in self-defense, especially if the official is violating the law. In the Weaver case, the marshal was out of his jurisdiction. He was trespassing on Randy Weaver's property. Further, Randy Weaver isn't even charged with killing U.S. Marshal Degan. As far as gun law being a tool in fighting crime, U.S. Attorney Hislop was way off base. It is ridiculous to think that laws restricting the use of guns, or confiscating them, will stop crime. In fact, when it is publicized that people in an area have guns, and have been trained in how to use them, crime is significantly reduced. Common sense would conclude that people with a criminal mentality will always be able to obtain guns. It is the law-abiding citizens who are deprived of the most effective means of self-defense, the gun. A lady, Paxton Quigley, learned this the hard way. Paxton Quigley tells about it in her book, Armed and Female. Ms. Quigley had worked in Robert Kennedy's campaign for president. When Kennedy was shot, she became a gun control advocate and worked towards that goal. She did an about-face in her views towards gun control when her apartment was broken into twice. 2 of her friends were raped, and her car was stolen as she watched from her kitchen window. She bought a gun and learned how to use it. This led her to do extensive research about guns and self-defense, and she then organized self-defense courses for women. Part of that self-defense was to be armed with a handgun and be trained to use it. 21. Terror on Ruby Ridge. She says that currently there are 12 million women in America who carry handguns for self-defense. One important fact stands out in her findings. When it is publicized by the news media that women in an area were armed, attacks against women greatly dropped. There can be no doubt that a neighborhood where law-abiding citizens are armed is a safer place than one where the law-abiding citizens are not armed. So why does the enemy keep pushing for gun control? Is it because the enemy fears the guns will someday be pointed in their direction? Jews strongly advocate gun control. A study of the National Committee for Handgun Control shows that of the 63 members, 30, nearly one half, are Jews even though they make up only 4% of the population. To be assured that Jews are strong advocates of gun control, all we have to do is read their own publications. The following are excerpts from an article in the Atlanta Jewish Times of January 1, 1990. Jewish organizations may be unanimous on the need for stricter gun control measures, but Aaron Zellman takes a different point of view. According to Zellman, what he called the gun hate of Jewish groups and legislators threatens a backlash of anti-Semitism. To promote this, Zellman has just formed a new organization, Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. Zellman argues that gun ownership is a basic value in Christian America. There are people who think God, guts and guns are what made America great. Gun ownership is something Christian America gets very upset about with Jews. American Survival magazine interviewed Aaron Zellman about his new organization Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership. Following are excerpts of what Mr. Zellman said. There are a small percentage of Jews, like myself, who are staunch supporters of gun ownership, but our story is censored by the liberal Jews who heavily influence the mass media and gov. 22. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Government, we may educate some Jewish anti-gunners and convert them to the pro-freedom, pro-American, pro-gun viewpoint. However, I'm not very hopeful that will happen. We plan to carry advertisements that are designed to attack and destroy the myths and lies that liberal Jewish commentators, writers, actors, and politicians spew forth every opportunity they get. Many Jews do not like what their Zionist/Marxist brethren are doing, but there are few like Aaron Zellman who have the courage to stand up to them. Guns freed our forefathers from British oppression. It was guns that enabled the colonists to stop oppression by England and winning freedom. Without those guns, we today could still be under the domination of England. Realizing the importance of guns in maintaining freedom in the newly formed country, the United States of America, our founding fathers wrote into the Constitution the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The gun controllers claim this only applies to the militia. But a law is what the writers of the law intended it to be. Many of our founding fathers plainly stated their intent. I lines just relate 3 of their statements. The Constitution shall never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. Alexander Hamilton. The very atmosphere of firearms everywhere restrains evil interference. They deserve a place of honor with all that's good. George Washington. The strongest reason for the people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny and government. Thomas Jefferson. 23. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Jews dominate federal government. Jews certainly know where the centers of power are. They heavily populate the world center of finance, New York City, and the political center of our country, Washington, D.C. My home state, with a population of 630,000, has just one synagogue. Metro Washington, with about 5 times as many people, has about 80 synagogues, according to the Washington Jewish Weekly. While we stupid Gentile slave trying to make a success of farming, the professions, or independent businesses in small towns and large cities, Jews living in Metro Washington have wormed their way into every department of our federal government. Nearly all US senators and representatives have Jews on their staffs. Without the influence of Jews, these congressmen would have a hard time getting re-elected. As I have said, many Jews do not like what their Zionist brethren are involved in. But they too must be dealt with cautiously. This is because the wealthy Jewish hierarchy exert tremendous pressure on them to keep them in line. The anti-Zionist, Rabbi Elmer Berger, emphasized this in one of his books. Rabbi Berger also made a statement that every Gentile should note. A few years ago, I attended a press conference at the National Press Building in Washington, D.C. Christians at the conference were complaining to Rabbi Berger about the excesses of the Zionist Jews. This anti-Zionist rabbi came back with, "These Zionist Jews are fighting for what they want. You Christians need to fight for what you want. Need more be said. Anti-Jewish feeling is growing." A recent article in the national press revealed that an anti-Jewish feeling is growing. Currently nearly 1/3 of the nation's population are critical of Jews. This figure is higher among blacks. This could be expected, since most blacks live in metropolitan areas as do most Jews. A large portion of blacks live in poverty, while a few miles away most Jews live in luxury. In addition, blacks rent from Jewish landlords and work in businesses owned by Jews. Thus, blacks. 24. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Are exposed to direct Jewish oppression, while relatively few whites are exposed to it directly. Frank Wallace, a frame-up victim of the Nazi hunters. An ongoing activity of the evil branch of Jews, the Zionists, is the phony search for people the Zionists claim killed Jews during World War II. One such target was Frank Wallace, an American who had migrated from Poland. Through persistence and at tremendous financial outlay, Mr. Wallace proved that the 11 Israelis had lied in testifying against him, and that half of them hadn't even lived in Poland. It is related in the book, Frank Wallace, a frame-up victim of the Nazi hunters. Jews go too far. My Jewish friend, Haviv Sheba, many times said that if the Zionist/Marxist Jews keep up their destructive anti-American acts, there will be a backlash against them, and that innocent Jews will suffer along with the guilty. Sheba would add, throughout history, my Jewish brethren have always gone too far in their destructiveness, and now they are going too far in America. Are the Jews afraid that the heavily armed American people will turn the barrels of their guns toward them? The enemy and their lackers keep crying, we must take the guns away from the criminals. By now, the gun-owning, law-abiding citizens of America know this is a lot of baloney. There have been 20,000 gun control laws passed restricting the use of guns, but it hasn't stopped criminals from obtaining them. The gun controllers have a good reason for trying to take guns away from law-abiding citizens. It is this: guns are the last defense against oppression, and the enemy fears that they could become the target of those who are oppressed. 25. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Gordon and Randy knew the dangers of the Jewish/Masonic cabal. Both Gordon Call and Randy Weaver had studied about how Jews and their Gentile front The Masons are the workforce destroying freedoms in America. Gordon was emphatic in saying that not all Jews and Masons should be blamed, only the higher-ups. This is especially true with Masons. Gordon said most Masons do not realize what the high-degree Masons are involved in. They join because it is a big help to succeed in business and the professions to be a Mason. They help each other. As far as Jewish involvement in anti-American acts, there are those who say there is no such thing as a good Jew. I strongly disagree. I lived and worked with Jews 4 of the 6 years I spent in our nation's capital. They were pro-American, anti-Zionist Jews, and I saw them suffer at the hands of their Zionist brethren for exposing the anti-American acts being committed by the Jewish elite and their Zionist followers. When I talked about how the Jewish international bankers were the cause of our nation's problems, the anti-Zionist Jew, Haviv Sheba, would say, "Ach, the bankers could do nothing if it was not for the Anti-Defamation League, ADL. The ADL is the network of Jews that reaches into every community of any size in America. The ADL is an arm of the Bnei B'rith, a Masonic lodge exclusively for Jews. Evidence indicates that Bnei B'rith is the Masonic lodge that directs the activities of Masonic lodges with Gentile, non-Jewish members. Jews are smart. Credit must be given to the Jews. They are politically active, well-informed, and aren't stingy when it comes to contributing toward the accomplishment of their goals." A few years ago, former Congressman Paul Findley wrote the book, They Dare to Speak Out. Anyone who has read it realizes the extent of Jewish power in foreign and domestic affairs of America. It leaves 26. Terror on Ruby Ridge. No doubt that no law of importance gets through Congress without Jewish approval. In recent years, there has been a strong anti-Jewish feeling in American English America. What can the Jews do to stop this threat? The obvious action is to create a state of fear by instigating periodic violent incident. The Jews themselves won't lead the assault on a target. They get their main front group, the US Marshals, to do the job. US Marshal Kenneth Moo, who led the attack on Gordon Cowell, was a Mason. I don't know, but I'd bet dollars to donuts that US William Degan was a Mason. Research has shown that most heads of police type agencies are Masons, as are nearly all judges. At the time of the US Marshals attack on Gordon Cowell in 1983, the head of the Marshals Service Field Operations was Howard Safir, a Jew. I don't know who is the current head of field operations, but it makes no difference, as he would have to be willing to carry out orders or he would be replaced. Create fear to stonewall action. Currently, a growing number of Americans are experiencing economic problems. The first thing that stirs people into action is to be hit in the pocketbook. To stop an uprising against those who are creating the economic problems, steps must be taken to throw the citizenry into fear. Before the attack on Gordon Cowell in 1983, farm foreclosures were reaching alarming proportions, and for the first time since the non-partisan League era, the sleepy North Dakotans were getting organized in an effort to stop the wholesale theft of property by the bankers and other money-creating moneylenders. The loosely knit group, of which Gordon Cowell and I were a part, were planning a series of meetings designed to combat unlawful farm foreclosures. The first meeting was set for February 20th. What could the money-lending crowd do to stop the threat? No crimes were being committed. All the farmers wanted to do was make 27. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The money-creating money-lenders obey the law. Gordon Cowell had an alleged violation. It didn't make any difference that it was a mere misdemeanor, and it didn't make any difference that the head marshal in North Dakota had been ordered to leave Gordon alone. It was an excuse to create an incident that would scare the locals back to being sheeple. It is more than a coincidence that 1 week before the first scheduled farm meeting, Gordon Cowell was attacked by members of America's leading domestic police agency, the US Marshals. North Dakota's tax commissioner stated that it was much easier to collect taxes after the Cowell incident, an indication that the incident had accomplished its obvious goal. The North Dakota populace had gone back to being good peons. With the foreclosure of farms continuing, the resulting effect was that the population of the state declined. While a few of the larger cities gained population, the rural areas declined an average of about 10%, leaving the smaller towns virtual ghost towns. The scenario that developed in Idaho leading to the attack on Randy Weaver was different in one respect. People who were disturbed over the growing oppression by government bureaucrats were moving to the sanctity of Idaho's northern forests and surrounding areas. If the force of pro-American activists grew too large, the area could be effective in stopping the un-American acts being committed by government officials. If successful, it could spread to other areas of America. The powers behind the scenes didn't dare let that happen. To stop the growing assembly of pro-Americans in northern Idaho and other areas of the Northwest, a violent incident needed to be created. Someone needed to be targeted who would not back down when confronted by the threat of violence. Randy Weaver was their man. Randy had already proved that he was a man of honor when he told federal agents to go to hell, do you own dirty work, when asked to infiltrate the Aryan nations. Unfortunately for the feds, Sammy's pet dog, Stryker, discovered the US Marshals' presence and this apparently fouled up whatever plan they had formulated against the Weavers. 28. Terror on Ruby Ridge. After the Marshals killed Sammy on Friday, the killing of Vicky on Saturday by an FBI agent, and the aborted plan to torch Weaver's cabin on Sunday, the violent action of Ruby Ridge came to a stop, resulting in a tense standoff. At the foot of the mountain, Gene Glenn, the agent in charge of the troops from the various police agencies, nervously pondered how to get out of the mess they had gotten themselves into. The final decision of what to do to cover up the unlawful acts committed by government agents would have to be made by bureaucratic bigwigs in Washington. The other parties to the standoff were the surviving Weavers and Kevin Harris, all suffering in mourning and in fear on the floor of the cabin. After the killing of Sammy and Vicky and the wounding of Randy and Kevin, they felt it was only a matter of time until the attackers would wipe out all of them. By doing this, there would be no witnesses left to give the honest version of the killings and woundings. Then, the American people would be given only the government's version. During Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, there were attempts by the government agents to entice the survivors out of the cabin. For instance, they rolled a robot by remote control to the cabin. On the robot was a telephone. Randy was asked to pick up the phone. After the killing and wounding that had taken place, Randy suspected such actions were only traps, and he refused to pick up the phone, especially since the robot had flashing lights, a shotgun mounted on it as well as a black box wrapped with wire. Then too, Randy was well aware of what had happened to Gordon Cowell when he was located in Arkansas. US Marshals and gunmen from other government police agencies didn't even try to arrest Gordon. They sneaked into the house where Gordon was staying, shot him in the back of the head, and torched the house to try to cover up their brazen act. James Bo Gritz and Jack McClamb rebuffed by feds. Late Wednesday afternoon, the third day of the standoff, 6 days after the killings started, James Bo Gritz and Jack McClamb appeared on the scene. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Bo Gritz was the most decorated Special Forces commander of the Vietnam War with 62 citations. The movie Rambo was based on Bo's heroic exploits. Randy Weaver had served under Colonel Gritz while stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Randy had Colonel Gritz's picture posted on one of the cabin's walls. About Randy, Colonel Gritz said, I remember him as a young, enthusiastic soldier who was trying to apply his skills at a time the country was at war. Jack McClamb is a retired Phoenix, Arizona police officer who had several awards for his outstanding police work. He currently publishes his own newsletter, Aid and Abet, warning police officers how they are being used to destroy our country. About a month before the killing of Sammy and Vicky, Randy had contacted Colonel Gritz and asked for his assistance, suspecting that he was being set up for some type of violent action. At the time, Gritz was the Populist Party's presidential candidate and was unable to respond to Randy's request. Later, Colonel Gritz blamed himself for not coming to Randy's aid. If he had, he could have generated enough publicity to force the feds to call off the obvious planned attack. After the attack occurred, Gritz interrupted his campaigning and, with Jack McClamb, came to help break the standoff without further loss of life. Gritz and McClamb went directly to the roadblock which had been set up by federal agents. They asked to speak to agent in charge, Gene Glenn. Glenn ignored the request. But he cannot entirely be blamed, because the decisions in this case, as in all such cases, come from Washington. In this case they were from William Sessions, probably in conjunction with other agency bosses. The refusal to allow Grits and McLam to go to the besieged cabin and try to talk Randy and the other survivors into surrendering continued for a full 48 hours. Frustrated, Grits said, "If the FBI won't let me go up there and try to 30. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Talk to a person that I have rapport with, face to face, then it shows the belligerency in this matter. As fate would have it, two patriots who knew the power of issuing citizens arrest warrants and how to draft them, helped Grits and McLam prepare arrest warrants, naming Agent Gene Glenn, FBI Director William Sessions, U.S. Marshal Service Director Henry Hudson and Idaho Governor Cecil Andrus. Governor Andrus certainly acted wrongly when he put Boundary County, where the killing took place, and nearby Bonners County under martial law, by failing to exert the state's jurisdiction in clearing up the mess federal agents had created. Andrus was surrendering state sovereignty to the federal government and was giving legitimacy to the presence of agents of the federal government, as well as giving these agents the opportunity to cover up their acts of misconduct. The main reason for issuing the citizen's arrest warrant was the refusal to allow Grits and McLam to try to bring the standoff to a peaceful conclusion. To effect the arrest warrants, Colonel Grits read its contents to the agents at the roadblock. As he was reading, one of the federal troopers, with a surly look on his face, pointed his gun at Grits. A supporter of the local citizens went to the agent and ordered him to point the gun away from Grits, and the agent obeyed, but after a few moments the agent again aimed his gun at Grits. At first the arrest warrants were ignored, but it wasn't long before one of Glenn's men came to the roadblock and announced that Glenn would meet with Grits. This meeting led to Glenn's approval for Grits to approach the cabin and attempt to talk to Randy Weaver and the other survivors. So, on this Friday, 2 full days after arriving, Colonel Bo Grits was allowed to approach Weaver's cabin. The survivors, still in a state of shock and fear, refused to open a door, but they did talk about what happened, including the killing of Vicky. One of Randy's comments was indicative of the depth of their fears. He said, "They are trying to make me another Gordon Cal." When Grits returned to the roadblock and informed Weaver's friends 31, Terror on Ruby Ridge, and other supporters that Vicky had been killed, it was the first revelation of her death. For 5 days, the federal gunman had failed to report it. But this shouldn't be surprising. They didn't report Sammy's death until 3 days after it happened. On Saturday, when Grits again approached the cabin, Randy said, "I can't go into the Babylonian courts and get a fair trial." Anyone who has observed one of their kangaroo trials knows Randy was correct in his thinking. Knowing Randy's thoughts, Bo Grits contacted the famed Wyoming lawyer, Jerry Spence. Spence, who enjoys fighting for justice for the underdog, agreed to defend Randy if he would surrender. Friday evening, Grits, accompanied by Jack McLam, returned to the cabin. Randy was told that Jerry Spence had promised to defend him. He further pointed out that Kevin, who was seriously injured, was an important witness and must not be allowed to die. With these thoughts in Randy's mind, the seeds of surrender were planted. On Sunday, the cabin door opened. With high hopes, Colonel Grits, accompanied by Jack McLam, Jackie Brown, a close friend of the Weavers, and the local Baptist minister, Pastor Sandlin, went to the cabin. The presence of Jackie Brown seemed to be the convincing development that enabled them to enter the cabin. After considerable discussion, it was decided to let Grits and McLam take the seriously injured Kevin Harris to where he could receive medical attention. At the government staging area, Kevin received first aid, and then, accompanied by Jack McLam, was flown to a hospital in Spokane, Washington, for further treatment. Bo Grits and Jackie Brown stayed and removed Vicky's body from the cabin, and Grits carried it down the mountain on his shoulder. The bodies of Vicky and Sammy were cremated, which is against the religious beliefs of the Weavers. It is assumed the bodies were cremated to avoid the possibility of revelation of incriminating evidence against the government gunman. 32. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The Weavers want to delay surrender. When Grits and McLam approached the cabin on Monday, it was with high hopes the government-created mess would be over. But it wasn't to be. The two were not allowed to enter the cabin. The Weavers wanted to delay surrendering until after September 9th, 10 days away. In their beliefs, September 9th is a special day. Grits and McLam were facing a critical moment. Before leaving for the cabin that day, the officer in charge, Gene Glenn, had informed Grits that, one way or another, the standoff would end that day. Obviously, this meant if the Weavers refused to surrender that day, the federal gunmen would assault the cabin. Grits and McLam had one ace in the hole left. It was a letter prepared the night before by friends of the Weavers. The contents of the letter convinced the Weavers it would be better to settle the matter in court, rather than risk losing more members of their family. The letter was slipped under the front door of the cabin. Soon they were talking back and forth. Finally, Grits and McLam were allowed to enter the cabin. The tension-filled holdout was over. Randy and his 3 daughters were escorted down the mountain by Grits and McLam. As they passed the Weavers' friend and other supporters, Grits waved to them. This wave was reported by the news media as an artsy salute. Baloney. An artsy salute is done with a stiff arm and stiff fingers, quite different from a wave. But then, such distorted reporting by the establishment's news media typical. While this brought an end to the armed assault on the Weavers and Harris by federal agents, the feds aren't done with them yet. Part of an indictment handed down by a federal grand jury charged Randy and Vicky Weaver, Kevin Harris and other members of the Weaver family, meaning Sarah, Rachel and 10-month-old Elisheba, with killing Deputy U.S. Marshal Degan, conspired to purchase a remote mountaintop residence, intimidated neighbors and law enforcement officers, had conversation and all other conspiracies. Dating back to 1982, it's probably the first time in the history of the United States that a 10-month-old has been indicted, said Weaver's attorney, Jerry Spence, 33. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Prior to the attack on the Weavers, there were other incidents that took place in northern Idaho against private citizens by federal agents. One incident consisted of agents from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms attacking a young man and his girlfriend, holding a baby, in front of a supermarket. There were many witnesses to this assault, including the market personnel. Feds can't keep their stories straight. Excerpts of a report, based on an interview with Deputy U.S. Marshal Arthur Roderick, contradicts other reports or just doesn't make sense. The interview took place after the funeral of Deputy Marshal William Degan. The report excerpts are in script type. Contradictions are in regular type. Deputy Marshal Arthur Roderick said, all hell broke loose when marshals encountered fugitive Randy Weaver, August 21st, near Weaver's mountaintop home. Rounds were coming in from everywhere. I drove into the woods and bullets were coming in from 3 different directions. A Portland, Oregonian report dated August 22, 1992, said Degan was killed by weapons fired that came from Weaver's cabin. Also, Roderick didn't mention that he had fired the first shot that killed Sammy's dog. He spoke of one bullet fired from the side without wounding him. I'm talking maybe 1/8 of an inch higher would have done me in, said Roderick. Can you visualize any part of the chest where 1/8 of an inch higher would do in a person? Roderick must think all Americans are stupid. Weaver, Harris and Weaver's teenage son, Samuel, came after them using a dog. In a later app report, Roderick stated, they saw the dog running at their position, followed by Harris carrying a rifle. He said he and others moved back down the slope, away from the cabin, rather than confront Weaver, because he might injure the teen. 34. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Aja. Roderick said he told Cooper and Degan the dog and Harris were after them, and that the 3 marshals took turns providing cover for one another as they moved down the slope. At one point, Roderick was leading the way back, because he knew the trails. He said he was about to take a right fork down to the marshals' base camp, when he glimpsed a man he believed to be Weaver. The man was in front of him, and off to the side, he said, screaming like a fool. At that point I said, stop federal marshals. And Bill yelled it, and Larry yelled it. The Oregonian related it differently. Degan stood up from his position behind a tree stump, identified himself and shouted, halt. Then shots started flying. Roderick said he and Cooper returned fire in the first stages of the shootout. After the first fusillade, Cooper told him that Degan had been hit. During the first lull in the shooting, Roderick started trying to make it back to his wounded friend. The Oregonian reported that Harris turned and shot Degan through the heart. Nothing about this was mentioned by Roderick in the interview. Why? It was then that a single shot rang out and just missed hitting Roderick. I dove back into the woods and there were more shots. Roderick said, I could see rounds all around us. Larry was taking shots too. He was trying to get Billy back. They radioed to the other surveillance team, whose members covered 1.5 miles of dense forest in 15 minutes, to get to the shooting scene. That team also was fired on from the cabin during the half-hour gun battle, said Roderick. If the marshals were in a dense forest and down the slope as Roderick has stated, how could Vicky, 16-year-old Sarah and 11-year-old Rachel see the marshals from the cabin and be able to shoot at them? The shooting subsided and they sent 2 marshals down the mountain. 35. Terror on Ruby Ridge. For help. The Oregonian reported 3 marshals were able to make it back down the ridge to safety. Attempts to get Degan back down were defeated by periodic gunfire from the cabin. Fears that a rescue team might be ambushed delayed its departure until after dark, Roderick said. Here again, how was it possible for those in the cabin to shoot at the marshals hiding in the dense forest, especially after they had moved down the slope as Roderick stated earlier in the article? First government version. First shots came from Weaver's fortified home. The first reports on how the shooting started made reference to the first shots as coming from Weaver's cabin. They read, U.S. Marshal Degan was shot and killed by a burst of automatic weapons fire that came from Weaver's home. Marshals are tight-lipped, refusing to say whether they returned fire on the home after the first shots were fired. This version is very different from Marshal Roderick's version given after the funeral for Degan, and different from other versions given by government officials as related by the news media. The Portland Oregonian used the term Weaver's fortified home. The day before we read Weaver has holed up in his fortress-like home. A later article referred to it and the outbuilding as a compound. After attorney Jerry Spence agreed to defend Randy Weaver, he commented, "It certainly wasn't a fortress. It looked like an old cabin in the woods." Any unbiased person who looks at a picture of the cabin can see that Mr. Spence was correct. Only a government agent or other irrational person would be foolish enough to call it a fortress. 36. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Appearance of military equipment gives impression that Randy Weaver was a dangerous person. Other first reports provide speculative reading. Truckloads of heavily armed officers dressed in camouflage and armed with M16 rifles and Heckler and Hawk MP5 machine pistols poured into the area. Armored troop carriers were seen going up Ruby Road toward Weaver's fortified home. Army helicopters and armored personnel carriers were moved to a command post below Weaver's home. The question must be raised, was it necessary to bring in all this military equipment and up to an estimated 500 men? After all, if the real reason was only to get the Weavers and Harris to surrender, a few dozen men could have hidden in the woods surrounding the cabin, and with a bullhorn, warn Randy and the others that they intended to wait until they ran out of food and water and be forced to surrender or die. The human body can last many days without food, but only a few days without water. Since there was no source of water inside the cabin, the Weavers and Harris could not have held out for long. Was Sammy's dog running backwards when it charged the marshals? Most accounts of how the fiasco started say a dog, Sammy's pet Labrador retriever, charged the marshals and that's why they shot the dog. Friends of the Weavers, with whom I have talked via telephone, say the dog was shot in the butt, with the bullet traveling forward through the dog's body. This would indicate that the dog was facing away from the marshals and not charging them as they claim. It would only be natural for a dog, once it had located the intruders, to turn toward his master, Sammy, when he arrived. How will the 37. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Marshals explain this? Will they say the dog was running backwards when it allegedly attacked them? It wouldn't be any more ridiculous than other statements made by the marshals and other government officials. One question they haven't been foolish enough to try to answer is, why were at least 400 men, with an assortment of military equipment, brought in to capture the surviving 2 injured men, 3 girls, ages 16 years, 11 years and a 10-month-old baby? The Weavers' friends stop government violence. The assembling of about 200 friends and other supporters of the Weavers at the roadblock leading to the besieged cabin brought a halt to the violence. It was the opinion of Colonel Bogritz that without their presence, all the Weavers and Harris would have been exterminated. With these 200 people watching what was going on, officials in charge put on their good guy hats. An August 26, 1992, Associated Press report stated, eventually Weaver, will wear out. We are going to give him every opportunity to end it. Lee Rasmussen, FBI legal advisor, said Tuesday, "We can't wait a long time." The Oregonian, August 28, 1992, related. Federal agents say they plan to wait them out rather than risk killing Weaver's wife and daughters, who are in the cabin as well. Now get this next report, as related in the Oregonian the next day, August 29th. The wife of fugitive, Randy Weaver, is dead, a federal agent said late Friday night. Late Friday night was after Bogritz had returned from his first trip to the cabin and had reported that Vicky had been killed. Also, the government gunman knew on Monday, August 24th, that Vicky had been killed on Saturday, August 22nd, because Sarah Weaver had hollered the news to them. Why did they wait until after Bogritz had revealed the killing? If waiting out Randy was their intention as they stated, why was Bogritz told on Monday, August 30th, that they were going to end this today one way or another? 38. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Were they, for some ulterior reason, going to change hats again? US Marshals team must have been an inept bunch. After US Marshal Egan and Sammy Weaver had been killed, there remained on the one side 5 US Marshals, and on the other side were Kevin Harris, Randy and Vicky Weaver, and 3 girls, Sarah age 16, Rachel age 11, and Ella Sheba only 10 months old. With this lineup, the Marshals must have been a pretty inept bunch to be pinned down, as they claim, by 2 men, a woman, 2 young girls and a baby, especially since the Marshals had the advantage of being protected by what Deputy US Marshal Roderick described as dense woods. As far as them being pinned down, we were told that 2 of the Marshals were sent to get help. Another version of this was that 3 Marshals were able to get away. If 2, or 3, or whichever version of this is correct, were able to get away, it is hard to believe that the 2 were pinned down in the dense woods by gunfire from the cabin. 400 carry out dinners for government troops. The news media played down the number of personnel from the various government police agencies. Reports varied from 100 to 250. As late as September 2nd, 12 days after additional gunmen started arriving, the Oregonian was still giving a low estimate. It stated, Weaver surrendered Monday morning, ending an 11-day standoff with more than 150 federal agents. Maybe they were correct in the number of federal agents, but omitted were the number of National Guard troops and state and local police. The September 14th, 1992 issue of the national publication People carried a story on the killings and the standoff that followed. As could be expected, there were serious distortions. For instance, the article said more than 100 state, local and federal law officers were summoned to the scene. According to on-site observers, there were a lot more than 100. 39. Terror on Ruby Ridge. An indication of the true number of gunmen present was related in a story, August 31st, that appeared in the nearby Bonners County Daily Bee. It reads, officials won't say how many officers have been deployed for the incident, but 400 takeout dinners were ordered from a Bonners Ferry restaurant one night last week. This would be a pretty good indication that 400 lawmen were on hand at that point during the siege. Weaver was involved in 2 wars, Vietnam and Ruby Ridge. Randy Weaver and Bogritz were in the military service during the Vietnam War. In that war, over 57,000 American boys died, many thousands injured, and several thousand abandoned to the hands of the communist enemy. These men were victims of intentional betrayal by top government officials, just as the Weavers and Kevin Harris are victims of criminal decisions made by unsavory people who have been placed in positions of power by the super rich. They and their allies' goal is to weaken America and force all of us into their one world scheme. The way we were pushed into the Vietnam War is as treacherous as the manner the Weavers were treated by armed government personnel. Commander James Stockdale, in the book, In Love and War, describes the treachery. Stockdale told how on August 2, 1964, one of the American destroyers that was patrolling the area off Tonka Bay in Vietnam gave notification that she was being menaced by some distant showing torpedo boats. Flight Commander Stockdale and other pilots flew to the area and sunk 3 PT boats that were fleeing the scene. 2 days later, August 4, 1964, there was another alert and a flight led by Stockdale responded. No attack boats were found. The commander of the destroyer fleet reported to Washington the lack of any visual sightings of boats by the destroyers and doubt there had been any boats out there that night at all. Back on the aircraft carrier, Stockdale was asked, "Did you see any boats?" 40. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Stockdale answered, "Not a one. No boats, no boat wakes, no ricochet soft boats, no boat gunfire, no torpedo wakes, nothing but Black Sea." The next day, August 5th, Commander Stockdale was awakened by the junior officer of the deck who said, "The captain sent me down to awaken you. We just got a message from Washington telling us to prepare to launch strikes against the beach, sir." "What's the idea of the strikes?" asked Stockdale. "Reprisal, sir." "Reprisal for what?" "For last night's attack on the destroyers, sir." Stockdale said he felt like he had been doused with ice water and asked himself, "How do I get in touch with the president? He's going off half-cocked." In his book, Stockdale wrote his thoughts of that moment. "We were about to launch a war under false pretenses, in the fact of the on-scene military commander's advice to the contrary. The decision had to be made from way up at the top." Interestingly, Stockdale wrote that a half hour before they manned their planes for the attack on oil tanks on the mainland, the president had announced on television that they would be striking North Vietnam targets. Just as the news media participated in covering up the manner by which Sammy and Vicky Weaver were killed by government agents, the news media covered up the treachery of President Johnson and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara by giving a fictitious report. For instance, after the attack on oil tanks by American planes, the magazines Time, Life, and Newsweek, among others, gave a detailed account of the attack on American destroyers by North Vietnam boats on August 4, 1964. Obviously, it was all false because, as you just read, the commander of the destroyer fleet had notified Washington they doubt there had been any boats out there that night at all. 41. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The fictitious story of the attack that didn't happen given by Time, Life, and Newsweek was nothing more than the usual use of false news to cover up unlawful, deceitful, or even treasonable acts by government officials. Why would the news media report in such a false manner? The late journalist John Swinton gave us that answer. "There is no such thing as an independent press in America. You know this, and I know it. Not a man among you dares to utter his honest opinion. Were you to utter it, you know beforehand that it would never appear in print. It is the duty of a journalist to lie, to distort, to revile, to use bad words, and to sell his country for his salary. We are the tools and the vassals, servants, of the rich behind the scenes. We are the marionettes. These men pull the strings and we dance. Our time, our talents, our lives, our capacities are the property of these men. We are intellectual prostitutes." Realizing this, it is with skepticism that I read all news items, and you should too. Certainly, the manner of reporting in the Weaver case gives reason to support skepticism. Unanswered key questions. The Spokane Spokesman Review, August 31, 1992, issue, gave this interesting background to the Weaver case. Weaver's trouble with the federal government began when he allegedly sold 2 sawed-off shotguns to a federal informant. He was indicted a year later on charge of possessing illegal firearms. It was another year before U.S. alcohol, tobacco and firearms agent and Boundary County Sheriff Bruce Whitaker could catch Weaver. He and his wife were arrested when they left the cabin for supplies in January 1991. But he was released the next day. If the alleged gun violation was serious, and if it did happen, why did government officials wait a year after the alleged gun sale to indict Randy? 42. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Why, after Randy was arrested, did they release him the next day? Since Randy had been under surveillance for 18 months, why didn't federal officers arrest him on one of his forays into the woods? A similar question is still being asked in North Dakota 10 years after US Marshals attacked Gordon Cal. The question, why didn't the Marshals arrest Gordon as he freely walked the countryside and streets of central North Dakota towns instead of violently swarming around him when he was with his wife, son and 3 friends on a Sunday afternoon, precipitated by a measly misdemeanor violation? These unanswered questions, along with conflicting statements, point out the devious mentality of America's top police agency heads and the mentality of those above them who give the orders. Is being a separatist and tax rebel bad? The very first Associated Press report on the shooting, in which Sammy Weaver and Deputy U.S. Marshal William Degan were killed, began a campaign to make Randy Weaver appear to be a bad guy. This done in order to draw the blame away from the marshals and place it on someone else. The most likely target was Randy Weaver. The first report and others that followed called Randy a white separatist who interprets the Bible to prohibit interracial marriage or mixing seed. Heck, there are many who believe the same interpretation, including blacks. One such black is Reverend Henry Mitchell. In one of his monthly newsletters A Star News, Reverend Mitchell wrote, "If it had been God's intention to have only one color of people on the earth, surely he would have established that one color from the beginning. I feel it is a sin before God for colors and races to mix. You may call me racist, but I'm not. When it comes to mixing colors, you can call me a segregationist, which I am. It was God that segregated the colors of people, not me. If Randy Weaver is wrong in his separationist interpretation of the Bible, he has lots of good people as company." 43. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The app article further stated, Weaver has been linked to the tax protest movement. If he is, he has lots of good company in this matter too. In 1979, the American Mercury printed an article written by Dr. Martin A. Larson. In part he wrote, in 1972, the Commissioner of Internal Revenue testified before a congressional committee that the agency knew of at least 5 million taxpayers who had ceased making reports. The taxpayer now has many means of self-defense if he will merely learn how to use them, which he did not possess before the tax rebellion began a few years ago. Since Dr. Larson wrote that article, the number of people who have stopped paying taxes has mushroomed. Why? Because more people are learning that the IRS is operating in violation of the law, and because people have learned to defend themselves against their unlawful acts. IRS agents, when confronting a taxpayer, do so in a threatening, imposing manner. Why? US Senator Bellman of Oklahoma answered that question when, before a Senate committee, he said, in a recent conversation with an official at the Internal Revenue Service, I was amazed when he told me, if the taxpayer of this country ever discover that the Internal Revenue Service operates on 90% bluff, the entire system will collapse. Why must they use bluff in trying to extort money from people? Because they are violating various laws, even violating rules in their own handbook, and must bluff if they are to succeed in their extortion racket. Presidential candidate Ross Perot was correct. Most people still think, how would our government operate if we didn't have the income tax? This thinking is faulty. During one of the debates of the last campaign for president, candidate Ross Perot states, the income tax is not used to run our government. And he was right. Most of the money collected through income taxes goes toward 44. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Paying the interest on our national debt. The rest goes toward paying that debt, which, as you know, keeps rising. If Congress issued debt-free money, as it is supposed to, instead of allowing private bankers to issue debt money, we wouldn't have the monstrous debt. As far as paying off the debt, various economists, not the government paid kind, have said that most of the debt could be cancelled, since those to whom we owe most of the money obtained it by fraud. A few years ago, a lady, I forgot her name, wrote the excellent book, Justice or Evolution. Near the end, she wrote, it is patriotic to be a tax rebel. After reading my short commentary on the income tax, you probably agree. If Randy Weaver was linked to the tax protest movement as the app article stated, Randy should be honored. If he was a tax protester, he was along with millions of others, trying to stop one of the most destructive actions taken against the American people. Please note that the second plank of the Communist Manifesto advocates a progressive income tax. Here's another thought about Randy and the income tax. Living off the land, as he and his family were, he probably didn't earn enough money to fall under IRS requirement to pay. Since most people still ignorantly believe we must pay income taxes, the app article played on this innocence. By saying Weaver was linked to the tax protest movement, those who are ignorant of the facts would, in their ignorance, think Weaver was a bad guy. The short book, How to Save 100% on the Income Tax, gives an insight into the unlawful unnecessary income tax. You won't find such information in any article put out by the deceptive Associated Press. Nor will you find it in any of the textbooks used in our state-approved schools. I just want to be left alone. The Weavers moved to northern Idaho, mainly to get away from the evils that have developed in the more heavily populated areas. Well, one thing that none of us can escape is evil action by law-breaking government personnel. 45. Terror on Ruby Ridge. A lady I once worked with is typical of the average American. I was telling her some of the corrupt things government officials were involved in when she shrugged her shoulders and said, "I don't understand politics, so I'm not interested. I just want to be left alone. I want to raise my children to be good citizens, educate them and give them a good Christian sense of values." Her intentions are certainly honorable. However, those who are currently running our government, especially those at the federal level, have no intention of leaving her or any of us average Americans alone. We must work well over 1/3 of a year just to pay taxes laid on us by Congress, state legislators and local taxing authorities. We are forced to do business with an unlawful money system that can only lead to destruction of our country. This debt money system has moved us from having a national debt of a mere $1 billion in 1913, when private banking took over the issuing of our nation's money, to currently over $4 trillion. That's 4,000 times a billion. Ironically, 1913 is the same year that the income tax came into existence. We are forced to obey the dictates of lawmakers and bureaucrats who pass laws and issue rules and regulations dealing with everything from how we can use our property to being forced to wear seatbelts. A retired Minnesota judge admitted to me that most of the laws, rules and regulations are in violation of our Constitution. We are forced to send our children to state-approved schools where they are taught distorted history and in many cases are taught the destructive look-see method of reading instead of the proven phonics method. Now they are being exposed to behavior modification and I'll be getting to that later. Those who currently run our government have no intention of leaving this lady or any of us alone, just as they didn't leave the Weaver family alone and the many thousands like them who have felt the oppressive hand of agents in the US Marshal Service, FBI, BATF, ICE, all protected by members of our corrupt dictatorial court system. Vicky taught her and Randy's children to avoid having her children exposed to the anti-family, anti-American, anti-Christian, secular humanist teaching taking place in our 46. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Cheyenne's public schools. Vicky Weaver taught Sarah, Rachel and Sammy at home. The education bureaucrats are unhappy with people who refuse to surrender their children to their humanistic teaching. Periodically, in some states, these bureaucrats take legal action to force the children into their schools or threaten to take the children away from their parents. In spite of this, home teaching is growing rapidly. After public school education took root in the 1830s, each school operated autonomously, with some control coming from state governments. At first, scholastic achievement was good. It started its downhill slide with the intrusion of John Dewey and his progressive education theories. Some public schools continued to provide an excellent education. At the worst, they weren't too bad. But, in the mid-1960s, the federal government unlawfully stuck its nose into education and scholastic achievement started its downhill slide. Once having its foot in the classroom doors, the federal government has expanded its role in education. And it's all being done unconstitutionally. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." Since nowhere in the Constitution does it even mention education, it is obvious this part of the Constitution was intended to prohibit the federal government from meddling in the area of education. To entice citizens, in 1965, to accept federal intrusion into education, the time-proven bait was used: money. Smelling extra money for their paychecks, greedy teachers backed federal involvement in education. At the time, I was teaching in a school with 33 teachers. Only 2 of us voted against accepting money from the federal government. We argue that historically, whenever the federal government gave money, along with it came controls. The rest poo-pooed the argument. Before the first dollar was sent from Washington, one senator said, "We want to know how the money is going to be spent." And that's the way it went. With every federal dollar given out went mandated rules on how the money was to be used. By teaching her own children, Vicky Weaver protected them from the terror on Ruby Ridge, bad effects of the federal intrusion. And by hiring a private tutor, the grandparents of the Weaver children intend to continue protecting them. But, now a new education wrinkle has been added that is designed to mess up the minds of students in our nation's approved schools. In a nutshell, it's behavior modification, the brainwashing of students through the recently launched America 2000 education program. Syndicated columnist Cal Thomas did an excellent expose of the approach to the America 2000 program that has been installed in Iowa and most, if not all, states. The headline of his article, which appeared in the Street, Paul, Minnesota, Pioneer, May 4, 1992, reads, "Good people must join to thwart multicultural education mob." In part, Mr. Thomas wrote, "I have seen the future of American education, and it is not pretty." Since 1988, the Iowa legislature has passed a series of laws mandating multicultural non-sexist education, MCNSE. These laws apply not only to public schools, but to accredited private, and even religious schools. Among the legal requirements is that all education be global in nature. The effect will be to purge all Iowa children of any pride in their state and nation. MCNSE, and similar movements in other states, is a formula for dismantling the uniqueness of America and removing incentives that have drawn so many immigrants to this country. In the past, when immigrants came here, they blended into American culture. While many celebrated their ethnic roots, they saw themselves first as Americans and only incidentally as people who had come from other ethnic, language and national backgrounds. All that will change if programs like those in Iowa are allowed to spread. Under their laws, America, its values and beliefs are to be regarded as no greater than any other country, since there is no Standard 48. Terror on Ruby Ridge. For truth, the state will dictate its version of the truth and seek to conform everyone to it. In case you think Cal Thomas is a crank who slammed the education establishment as a personal vendetta, note information given by others. Help. Someone has stolen my child. The above is the title of a report on how schools are being designed to mold children so that they will be good citizens in the new world order. The report was based on a study done by Joan Gubbins, an Indiana state senator for 12 years. Mrs. Gubbins was chairwoman of the Senate Education Committee, so she can be considered credible. She stated, "There's a well-financed and intricately planned program in Indiana and across the nation to take over the rearing of our children by government-chosen, trained, and licensed experts. The children are to be brought up according to a government-chosen theory of child development instead of the parents' beliefs and moral values." Adding strength to her findings, Mrs. Gubbins quoted a few psychologists, among them Dr. Ashley Montag, who said, "The American home is an institution designed for systematic creation of mental illness in children." Drive Pierce, from Harvard University, speaking to 2,000 teachers in Denver, agreed, "Every child in America who enters school at the age of 5 is mentally ill." Drive Reginald Laurie, a past president of the Joint Commission on Mental Health, says, "There is serious thinking that maybe we can't trust the family to prepare young children for the new kind of world." Senator Joan Gubbins summed up the problem facing parents this way: "We now find prevalent among America's educrats and social engineers a mindset which accepts government takeover of child rearing. Many superintendents and most teachers don't know what America 2000 is all about." 49. Terror on Ruby Ridge. America's education leadership are touting the new America 2000 program without telling what it is all about. Why? Former Congressman John Rarick, when he was in Congress, answered that question in this manner: "If Congress, or the bureaucrats, were to come right out and proclaim that they were going to take America's children away from their parents and home, and put them all under federal control, custody and ownership, the parents would rise up in protest and indignation. So, what is bad must be disguised to appear good or at least economically beneficial, in order to be sold to an unsuspecting citizenry." The Michigan Alliance of Families, SEPDOCT, 1991, newsletter sounded this warning: America 2000, an education strategy, is a bold, comprehensive and long-ranged plan to move every community in America toward national education goals. The term comprehensive is the key, because the national education goals have little to do with education as far as what the average citizen perceives, but much to do with social engineering and government control of child development. If and when these goals are implemented and become a reality, the freedoms we have always cherished and valued will have been eradicated and the traditional family annihilated. The government will assume full responsibility for the total development of the child, emotional, social, psychological and spiritual. Fundamentalist Bible-believing Christians, watch out. The following statement by a Nebraska state legislator, who was also state head of the PTA, a lobbyist for the National Education Association, and the State School Board Association. We have to control church schools, because fundamentalist Bible-believing Christians do not have the right to indoctrinate their children in their faith because we, the state, are preparing all children for the year 2000. I have received a great amount of other material from states where parents have united to fight the destructive America 2000 program. 50. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The information is best summed up in an article that appeared in The Wanderer, a Catholic publication dated March 31, 1992. Pennsylvania moms vow to kill state-mandated values tests. The above headline indicates the concern mothers have over the behavior modification activities taking place in Pennsylvania schools. Following are excerpts from the article. Educator William J. Maloney warned the more regulation is better approach to education will destroy what hasn't already been ruined. Over the past 15 years, the behavioral scientists in Pennsylvania's Department of Instruction collected, without parental knowledge, data on the beliefs, attitudes, attributes, and behavior of schoolchildren, and filed them in an accessible central data system. One parent, Anita Hodge, discovered how Pennsylvania bureaucrats violated federal education laws, compelling students to reveal their most secret and private thoughts and beliefs to feed the data banks of the extreme behaviorists who dominate the education system. Once the data was collected, analyzed, and stored, parents learned it was used to develop ever more accurate tests, to reveal students' attitudes and behaviors, and to help teachers form correct attitudes through remedial education. In order to graduate from high school, a student must demonstrate that he has the correct attitudes. A state representative, Joseph Pitts, said he is concerned about any portion of these regulations that discuss or require students to change attitudes, beliefs, and values. It is the responsibility of the family to inculcate these. Randy and Vicky Weaver were doing this very thing, teaching their children pro-American and Christian values and beliefs. They refuse to surrender their children to the edocrats, who dominate the behavior modification factor is called state-approved schools. By teaching their own children, the Weavers were doing their best to insulate the children from the bad influences of society, drugs, crime. 51. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Immorality and the influence of humanist education. This was admirable. It is also admirable that the maternal grandparents of the Weaver children will provide them with a tutor instead of surrendering them to one of ours behavior modification factories. However, the grandparents, as well as the rest of us, must realize that the influence of these behavior modification factories cannot be escaped. We all must live in a society inhabited by others, including those who attend these factories. One byproduct of these factories will be felt by the Weavers immediately. It is the result of school program called mock trials. In this program, students are taught how courts operate. Lawyers provide guidance for the program. As you can probably guess, students learn the judge-dominated court procedures, completely ignored as the way courts are supposed to operate as set down by our founding fathers. It is in the judge-dominated type of court that Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris are to be tried, which is at this writing, scheduled for February 2, 1993. The Weavers tried to escape the influence of what no honest person can deny, an evil society, nor can any of us escape. So, we have two choices: surrender to the evil forces or fight them. US district judges and US attorneys are America's leading cover-up gang. Few government officials would dare take unlawful acts against law-abiding private citizens if it were not for the protection our nation's corrupt courts give them. With courts that would render justice, those citizens would be able to bring the offending government officials to court and receive satisfaction. Instead, it is like Jerry Spence wrote in his book, with justice for none, unless you are rich or have powers. There is no justice in America, with US Marshals and other shady government agents having the 52. Terror on Ruby Ridge. use of taxpayers' money and the power of our corrupt courts behind them, few average citizens have a chance of getting justice. In cases where government agents take unlawful action against law-abiding citizens and it ends up in a fiasco as it did in the Gordon Cal and Randy Weaver cases, the courts participate in a cover-up. The blame is diverted from the law-breaking government officials and placed on the real victims. Since nearly all judges, prosecuting attorneys, as well as other lawyers, are Masons, it gives court protection to government agents who victimize people, because the bureaucratic bigwigs are also Masons, and by their Masonic oath they swear to protect each other. Occasionally a person, who is a high-degree Mason, is of such strong character that he is able to remain a Mason and still act honorably, but they are few and far between. Weaver and Harris are to be tried in federal court. The trial of Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris is scheduled to start February 2, 1993, in U.S. District Court in Boise, Idaho. Earlier in this book, you read about the all-important matter of jurisdiction. Clearly, the marshals who were on Weaver's property were out of their jurisdiction. When it comes to trying an accused person in court, the feds take the attitude that, since federal personnel were involved, the federal government has jurisdiction. Regarding this, I repeat the following court case, because of its importance, to bring the offense within the jurisdiction of the Union. Federal, it must be committed out of the jurisdiction of the state. It is not the offense committed, Chief Justice Marshall said, but the place in which it was committed. People v. Godfrey, 17 Johns, 225 NY, 1819. There are other court decisions that come to the same conclusion. In spite of these court decisions and the constitutional citation on jurisdiction, I'd give odds that Weaver will face the U.S. District Judge Ryan with U.S. attorneys doing the prosecuting. Can Weaver and Harris expect a fair trial facing these key figures? After watching the trial of the victims in the Gordon Cal case, I'd say 53. Terror on Ruby Ridge. No. You can read about that trial in the book, Judge Paul Benson, Portrait of a Bastard. Don't let the terror bastard turn off those of you who are Christian. One definition of bastard is taken from the Bible. Hebrews 12:8 reads, "But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, they are bastards not sons." Since Judge Paul Benson, like nearly all judges, is a Mason, his god is Lucifer and thus, not a son of the God of the Bible, but a bastard. The jury is the judge. In a jury trial, jury members are of utmost importance. It is the jury who will decide whether the accused is innocent or guilty. The judge is supposed to be nothing more than a chairman, referee, whose sole duty is to keep proceedings moving smoothly. But today's judges have become virtual dictators, especially federal judges. They are appointed for life and are virtually impossible to remove from office. To insulate them from lawsuits for misconduct, rulings have been made that protect judges from being punished for misconduct. Note the following taken from 603 Federal Reporter 2nd Series, the 26th of September 1979. Unless he acts in clear absence of all jurisdiction, a judge has absolute immunity from liability damages. And from 500 Federal Reporter 2nd Series, the 7th of February 1974, is this gem. Generally, judges are immune from suit for judicial acts, or in excess of jurisdiction, even if those acts have been done maliciously or corruptly. Since judges are shielded from punishment for committing unlawful acts in court, judges manipulate court proceedings and juries to get the verdict they desire. It was with this protection that Judge Paul Benson manipulated court proceedings and railroaded Gordon Cal's son and 2 others to prison. 2 of the 3 were for life. Several of the jurors have been heard to say, "We thought the fellows were innocent, but we believed we were obligated to follow the judge's instructions." Judge Benson would not have gotten away with the criminal act of jury tampering if members of the jury had known their rights and powers, which are stated in the following court decisions. 54. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The common law of the jury, to determine the law as well as the facts, remain unimpaired. Georgia v. Brailsford, 1974, and State v. Cotto, 1849. In the Georgia v. Brailsford case, former U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Jay said to the jury, "It may not be amiss to remind you of the good old rule, that on the question of fact, it is the province of the jury, and on the question of law, it is the province of the court to decide." But it must be observed that by law, you have nevertheless a right to take it upon yourselves to judge both, in controversy, both objects lawfully within your power of decision. If that isn't enough to convince you that judges are acting criminally in instructing juries as they do, here are a few other Supreme Court decisions. The jury has the power to bring the verdict in the teeth of both law and facts. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Homing v. D.C., 1920. The jury possesses the undisputed power to acquit, even if its verdict is contrary to the law as given by the judge, and contrary to the evidence. U.S. v. Moylan, 1969. The jury possesses the unreviewable and irreversible power to acquit in disregard of the instructions on the law given by the trial judge. U.S. v. Dougherty, 1972. The decisions in these court cases show the brazen extent to which today's judges have gone. And there's more about how government officials are protected, even if they commit crimes. As the trial of the victims in the Gordon Kahl case was getting underway, an Associated Press article appeared with this information. The Supreme Court says government officials cannot be sued for lying, even if their false testimony leads to an unjust criminal conviction. Now, isn't that a brazen ruling? Private citizens can end up in prison for perjury, lying in court, but police officers and other government officials are not penalized when they lie. 3 of the Supreme Court justices, who were disgusted with the decision of the majority of their 55 terror on Ruby Ridge fellow justices, stated, police officers and other government officials potentially are more dangerous than private citizens. Despite the apparent prevalence of police perjury, prosecutors exhibit extreme reluctance in charging police officers with criminal conduct. With the obvious lying by government officials during and after the 11-day siege of Ruby Ridge, we can expect further lying by them on the witness stand in the upcoming trial of Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris. One side is lying, and one side is telling the truth. At a trial I attended in North Dakota about a year ago, the judge told the jurors, in effect, in a trial, one side is telling the truth, and one side is lying. Your job is to determine which is telling the truth. The judge allowed all lines of questioning and presentation of evidence. The defendant was found innocent because it was obvious to the jurors that the prosecutor's witnesses were lying, as was the city detective who engineered the attempted frame-up. Instead of being punished, this government detective was promoted to a state job, that of criminal investigator in the North Dakota Attorney General's office. Hopes and fears about the Weaver-Harris trial. Since the circumstances surrounding both the Gordon Kahl and the Weaver-Harris case are similar in many ways, and since the defendants in both cases were tried in federal courts, let's briefly review the various ways in which the Benson court acted improperly. 1. The defense attorneys asked Judge Paul Benson to withdraw from presiding over the case because he had close ties to the 2 dead marshals. Benson refused, saying, "I have no closer ties to the 2 dead marshals than I have with any other government employee." If you read what kind of men were the US Marshals who attacked Gordon Kahl, you will see that Benson had very close ties to 56. Terror on Ruby Ridge. US Marshal Kenneth Moo. You will read how Benson had pulled some political strings and shady maneuvers to get US Marshal Harold Bud Warren to resign and allow Benson's friend, Moo, take his place. 2. Officers providing security around the federal building where the trial was held were US Marshals. Those who were guarding the defendants appeared to have been recruited from the worst of the underworld. They had cold killer-like looks about them. Especially threatening were their frozen stares as they sat or stood motionless. This created a sinister air in the courtroom. 3. Picking of the 114 persons in the jury pool was done in virtual secrecy, and the final 12 members picked raises suspicion of hanky-panky in the picking of the jury pool. None of the jury members were from the northern 1/3 of the district, which included 2 major cities. Yet, 2 were picked from the small town of Hope, population 406, and 2 from the town of Hankinson, population 1158. It seems too much of a coincidence that Hankinson was the hometown of one of the 2 prosecuting attorneys. It was also the hometown of a deputy US Marshal based in Fargo at the time. 4. Whenever one of the defense attorneys pursued a line of questioning or presentation of evidence that would help prove the defendant's innocence and the marshals in the wrong, prosecuting attorney Lynn Crooks would object. Invariably Judge Benson would sustain the objection, thus preventing the defense lawyer's attempts to give the jurors a full picture of the circumstances surrounding the attack on the defendants by the marshals. 5. Several US Marshals and FBI agents, who were not present at the shooting, testified as expert witnesses. 6. Judge Benson gagged the defendants. While they were prevented from talking to news reporters, the prosecuting attorneys were free to release information and spout their opinions freely. 7. The final act of impropriety was Judge Benson's 60 pages of instructions to the jury. Apparently it was Benson's instructions, not the evidence, that persuaded the jurors to find the three fellows guilty. As stated earlier, some of the jurors have been heard to say, "We felt the fellows were innocent." 57. Terror on Ruby Ridge. But we believed we were obligated to follow the judge's instructions. Another case need mentioning since it too took place in Judge Benson's court where he ignored all sense of justice and common decency in order to get a conviction. In this case, the victim was Leonard Peltier, an Indian. The federal agents in the Peltier case were from the US Marshals brother agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. Trouble started when some FBI agents began meddling in the affairs of Indians living on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. A confrontation resulted, and shooting from both sides took place. When the smoke cleared, 2 FBI agents were dead. Unable to determine who killed the 2 federal agents, government police arbitrarily arrested 3 Indians who were active in Indian affairs. 2 of the Indians were tried in Waterloo, Iowa, where an all-white jury found them innocent. The feds were on the spot. They needed a conviction of the 3rd Indian, Leonard Peltier, in order to divert blame from the intruding FBI agents. So they brought Peltier to Fargo, North Dakota, to face the infamous Judge Paul Benson. As could be expected, Judge Benson engineered a conviction and sentenced Peltier to 2 life terms in prison. At the end of the first day of the trial of Gordon Calsuniori and 2 friends, I was standing outside the federal building where the trial was being held. An elderly Indian approached me and said, "This trial is starting out just like the Leonard Peltier trial." The conviction and imprisonment of Peltier was so blatantly engineered by Judge Paul Benson and US Attorney Lynn Crooks that the FBI has had to carry on a continuous campaign to stonewall efforts to force a retrial. The Minneapolis Tribune, dated December 20th, 1992, related an effort by some members of the Minneapolis, Minnesota, City Council to pass a resolution calling for a retrial of Leonard Peltier. To try and stop the council's action, about 35 FBI agents and 25 Hennepin County Sheriff's deputies attended the meeting and expressed opposition. The sheriff and his chief deputy lobbied council members to reject. 58. Terror on Ruby Ridge. The resolution. Interestingly, the sheriff is a former FBI agent. Lisa Ferraro, who heads the Peltier Defense Committee, commented, "There is no reason for FBI agents to be there other than to frighten city council members. It's pure and simple intimidation and the FBI is very good at that, as we have come to know." The next day, December 21st, 1992, the Minneapolis Tribune carried comments by a member of Peltier's defense team, the famed attorney William Kunstler. Following are excerpts from his comments. The invasion of the Minneapolis City Council, December 18th, by some 35 FBI agents and 25 Hennepin County Sheriff's deputies, to oppose a resolution calling for a new trial for Leonard Peltier, was disgraceful. This type of intimidation is particularly outrageous, since a federal appeals court has already accused the FBI of improper conduct in Peltier's case. In addition, the government has conceded that 3 affidavits used to extradite Peltier from Canada were fabricated. An appellate court pointed out that many of Judge Benson's evidentiary rulings clearly hampered the defense. The FBI is afraid of a new trial because it knows that Peltier would be acquitted. The only difference from that evidence introduced against his defendants, who were acquitted in Cedar Rapids, was the testimony of an FBI ballistics expert who stated that a shell casing found near the bodies of the 2 agents was extracted from a rifle attributed to Peltier. However, years after Peltier's 1976 conviction, a Freedom of Information suit brought on his behalf uncovered a report by this same expert that the weapon in question had a different firing pin from that in the rifle used to kill the agents. According to the appellate court, had this report been turned over to the defense, as required by law, Peltier's trial counsel would have been able to cross-examine certain government witnesses more effectively. On his appeal, one of the judges, when informed of the FBI's fabrication of the affidavits used to extradite him from Canada, said, "What happened gives some credence to the claim that the United 59 Terror on Ruby Ridge states is willing to resort to any tactic in order to bring someone back from Canada. And, if they are willing to do that, they must be willing to fabricate other evidence." In addition, the government, which originally claimed that Peltier was a cold-blooded executioner who had shot the two agents point blank after they had been severely wounded, now has admitted that we don't know who shot the agents. Given this admission, plus the fact that the FBI was guilty of hiding evidence favorable to Peltier and creating false documents, it would have been far more appropriate for the agents and deputies who flooded the city council session to join the worldwide support for a new trial, instead of stampeding the city council into withdrawing the wholly justified resolution. O'Hara would be better advised to give Peltier a chance to have a fair trial. The FBI has thus far denied him. Remember, the above expose of criminal acts committed by FBI agents was done by the famed attorney William Kunstler. I have included his expose of the FBI because it was FBI agents who killed Vicki Weaver, and they will be testifying in the trial of Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris. In view of the deceit and fabrication of evidence in the Peltier case, any statement made by FBI agents and their brother agents, the US Marshals, during the trial of Randy and Kevin must be viewed with suspicion. Jerry Spence could make a difference. The two railroad jobs conducted by Judge Benson and other cases with which I'm familiar lead me to fear that Randy Weaver and Kevin Harris will experience similar frame-up tactics in their trial. One factor in the Weaver-Harris case that may make a difference will be the presence of Jerry Spence. He is a tough attorney from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, who is defending Randy Weaver and advising the attorney for Kevin Harris. In view of Spence's success recording court, the only way the judge in this case will be able to engineer a conviction will be for him to dictatorially and unlawfully curb Spence's efforts, and for the judge to 60. Terror on Ruby Ridge. Help form a jury that doesn't know they are the judge in the case, and that they can ignore the judge's instructions. There is one other possibility. Threats by government officials against Jerry Spence that would scare him into being an obedient officer of the court and cause him to fail to do what he is capable of doing. If either Weaver or Harris are convicted, we can rightfully give this warning. You could be the next victim of the law-breaking government officials. Welcome to the real America, the land of opportunity. This was the image Lorenz and Wasiliki Kadef had of the United States of America when they left their Switzerland home. They came to begin a new life in this land of opportunity. They made a deal to buy Deep Creek Resort in Bonners Ferry, Idaho. Wasiliki and Lorenz and their children were a happy family. Little did they know that within 7 weeks after arriving in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, their happy family life would be shattered. When Lorenz saw military equipment and armed personnel going to Weaver's home, he helped all he could at his resort, hoping and praying for the peaceful surrender of the Weaver family and Kevin Harris. Lorenz kept open the doors of the resort longer than the normal business hours to accommodate the many folks who had arrived on the scene to help. Lorenz fed those who were hungry, even if they didn't have money to pay for it. He further showed his hospitality to Colonel Bogritz by having him stay above the restaurant in his own personal living quarters. Lorenz was the most saintly Christian man I have ever been around, said one of the Christian Patriot men who had observed Lorenz's helpful attitude and marveled at his ability to offer even biblical insight on subjects discussed during the 11-day siege at Ruby Ridge. Before the military build up at Ruby Ridge, Lorenz was a happy-go-lucky, loving fellow. But after the federal invasion, his personality completely changed. For instance, one time he hit one of his best friends. When told about it later, he didn't remember anything about the incident. It is reported that not long after the siege at Ruby Ridge, Lorenz had a nervous breakdown. He was hospitalized with nervous breakdowns. 61. Terror on Ruby Ridge. 4 times within a month, and given the medication called Prozac. Government intrusion into people's lives in America, even the violent kind, has become so common that the general American public is callous to it. But it was new to Lorenz. Within 3 months of the invasion at Ruby Ridge, Lorenz was still emotionally affected. While crossing a street, November 18, 1992, Lorenz Kaddafi stepped in front of a truck and was killed. Lorenz Kaddafi's death was not due to gunfire by government agents, yet it must be shouldered by what was once our government. The death of Lorenz Kaddafi has left his wife, Vasiliki, with the sole responsibility of running the resort. Also, it has left her in a financial bind. A bind to the point that there is danger of losing the property. Welcome to the real America, Vasiliki, 62.